Anyway, I want
But
to introduce David Francisco. David is my cousin. He's been living in Sweden for a little over 20 years, working for a telecommunications manufacturer. And, he's practices Judaism and has some information on the background of Jews in Sweden and to an extent to Scandinavia. And I thought it would be interesting as an extension of a program we started a couple of months ago to have David speak about the Jews of that part of the world. Some of you attended a session that we had in February with our rabbi's former student, Matt Daniels, who has also been offshore in India for the last 20 years.
wow.
And in fact, he even, I think, has a Jewish food business, something like What's New Delhi is the name of it. And because of where he lives, it's a seasonal town. He comes back home to, I'm not sure if it's Detroit or Chicago, and has a similar culinary business stateside. So he talked to us at length about that. And that was fascinating to hear about the history and the situation today. And then also looking to the future, because this sounds like a topic that's of interest to others. One of our temple members, oh, here's Amy. One of our excuse me, temple members, Gary Melton, just returned from a tour of duty in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He's a educational administrator. He's been there before. He went back, and he has just returned. And he said he'd be willing to do a program on the Jews of Southeast Asia. So we'll try to keep this idea going, and maybe even the Jews of North Dakota, like Roberta was saying. But I'd like to turn over the microphone and the screen to David Francisco. We're going to have David talk for a while and then have plenty of time for your questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Michael. I should probably kick off by just saying I apologize sincerely for having to cancel the last time at the last minute. I hated doing that, but I'm honored that you were willing to have me back again, and I'm happy to see you all here today. I'm going to talk as we started, as Michael in his very kind intro saying about the Jews of Sweden from a historical perspective, but I think I feel like I need to add a few disclaimers. I'm not Swedish is the first one. I'm from New Jersey, but and I'm not a historian either. So whatever I say, you maybe not take with a grain of salt, but you know it's coming from an amateur. That said, I've lived in Sweden for over 20 years. My wife is Swedish. You know, I have a pretty good understanding about Swedish culture, and I've studied Jewish history, and you know, I'm active with the community here. So it's not coming from a complete perspective of ignorance, but I'm still an amateur when it comes to Sweden, or at least an outsider when it comes to Sweden and Jewish history. But that said, I'm gonna bring up I have a few slides here that I'm gonna share right now, and then I'm gonna get started by just Michael did a great introduction, but I just wanted to get a start and share a little bit just more about who I am, and you could see the picture to the right. That is my family, my wife Anita, and my three boys, Benjamin, Max, and Ellis, who are 15, 13, and 9 now. And so we live at these coordinates. That's Stockholm, Sweden. And the interesting thing about this, I put this up because Stockholm, it's pretty far north. It's at 59 degrees, which is the same as Juneau, Alaska.
Wow.
But it's also really far east too. It's about the same. It's far east as like Warsaw, Poland. So it's a pretty out of the way corner of Europe. And the only reason that people live here at all is because we have this gift of the Gulf Stream, which has warmed it up enough so that you can grow things and have at least some bearable summers that you can that you can live here. But really, what I wanted to talk about today is, or what I am going to talk about is how the Jewish community established itself in this pretty far off corner of Europe, and how it's evolved since then. Um, and kind of take you through just a brief history of how the Jewish community has kind of evolved in Sweden. And then towards the end of the talk, I'll very briefly kind of take you through some of the big issues, maybe for lack of a better word, that are impacting Sweden and the Jewish community right now, because I know you see a lot of that, or you could be exposed to that on the news. And then I'll open up for some questions. So if that's all right, I'm gonna get started first with kind of a look at what the Jewish communities in Scandinavia, kind of a big picture. This is a map of Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland. The Jewish community in Sweden is the largest in the region, with about 20,000 people. Followed afterwards by Denmark, which has about 8,000. That community is a little bit older than the Swedish Jewish community, mainly because it's just closer to continental Europe, to Germany. Norway and Finland have very small Jewish communities, around 2,000 people each. I think the thing that is unique about the Jewish community in Sweden is that for a number of reasons, but mainly because Sweden was neutral during the Second World War, the Swedish population, the Jewish population in Sweden remained intact. There was no occupation, and so it's kind of a uniform community where there was a lot of displacement, a lot of devastation in other European communities. The Swedish Jewish community was not at least directly impacted by the Second World War, and that's a good thing. But if we go back sort of to where it all started, I mean, I think I should start by saying Sweden, when you have the first records of Jewish settlement, or at least Jews being mentioned in Sweden, Sweden looked very, very different. It was an empire back then. It was one of the more powerful empires in Europe. Sweden was what you see of Sweden today in green, but it also included parts of what is Norway, parts of Germany down here on the bottom, pretty much all of Estonia and Latvia, as well as significant parts of Russia, including St. Petersburg. These are Swedish cities. And this is going back, the first mention of Jews residing in Sweden go back to the 1500s, including a doctor to Sweden's most famous king, Gustav Vasa. But during this time, it was still forbidden for Jews to live in Sweden. It was against the law. There was a state religion that was Lutheranism, and it was illegal. It was forbidden to practice any other religion except for Lutheranism. So there was no Jewish community, and there was no real significant Jewish presence until about 250 years ago, when one guy from Germany who was a skilled engraver, a metals engraver, he showed up at the port in Stockholm and wanted to set up business. That guy's name was Aaron Isaac, and he is this picture to the right. He is the founder of the Jewish community in Sweden. And basically, the guilds, or like the aristocrats that ran different sectors of the economy in Sweden, there was a lot of demand for engraved silver, engraved metals, and they didn't have those kind of skills anywhere in Sweden, or at least in the big cities. And so they brought over this guy, Aaron Isaac, and they invited him over to Sweden, and because they all wanted to make some more money. So he was allowed to move here, and he must have made a pretty good name for himself, because he lived here for a year, and after a year, he petitioned the King of Sweden, which is a pretty bold move for a guy who a year ago was illegal to live there. But he petitioned the King of Sweden to allow him to bring 10 other Jewish men so he could form a minyan. And the king allowed them and their families to come and reside in Stockholm. And they established the first synagogue, which you can still visit today. It's not an active synagogue, but it's the Jewish Museum in the old town of Stockholm. And after a few years of this group of 10 men and their families, the king also lifted the ban on Jewish immigration and allowed small numbers of Jews to start to move to additional cities, like included in addition to Stockholm. So Stockholm, a city on the west coast called Gothenburg, and then one other city, a smaller city called Norrköping, which at the time was kind of the center of textile production in Sweden. And again, this wasn't about any kind of broad, enlightened perspectives. This was about the economy. They knew that skilled Jewish artisans would be good for the Swedish economy, and they were. But the road to any kind of full equal rights for Jewish citizens or Jewish residents, they weren't citizens yet. Yeah. I'll get to that. Full emancipation and equal rights for any Jewish residents of Sweden, that would take a very long time. And the first major step on that road, there's this document you see to the right. It's called the Judereglementet, and that is kind of a proclamation by the government or by the king, the proclamation about Jewish residency, which basically allowed Jews to move to Sweden without having to convert. Previously, if you were going to move, you had to convert, except for these few artisans that they allowed in. But in this 1782 proclamation, now Jews could move to Sweden with a lot of restrictions, but they didn't have to convert to Lutheranism. This was a huge step because this had to be cleared by the king. The king was the head of the Swedish church. So this was a big step towards becoming actual Swedish citizens. But I mentioned before that they were only allowed to settle in Stockholm, Gothenburg, and this smaller town of Norrköping, and they had a ton of restrictions on them. For example, before they could come to Sweden, they had to show that they had at least 10 years of salary in their savings. So basically, they were only allowing in wealthy immigrants. They were only allowed to work in a very finite set of professions within like metal engraving, textiles, and just very specific, because the entire economy is controlled by these guilds. And they were definitely not allowed to work in any government jobs. And this restriction at least remained on the books in Swedish law up until the 1950s. And I don't know if it was actually enforced as late as the 1950s, but there was still a law that, if you didn't practice the state religion, you couldn't hold elected office or an office in the government. But this, towards the 1800s, Sweden started to go through a number of started to introduce easing of these types of restrictions, and they had like a series of policy changes that started to open up for more equal rights for Jewish citizens, and that included things like in 1838, Sweden recognized Jews as Swedish subjects rather than as foreigners. In 1846, the guild system was abolished, so then you could start to work in professions other than that limited set of professions that they were restricted to. 1854, they could move into any Swedish city, as opposed to the 3 that they were originally only allowed to live in. A decade later, the prohibition against mixed marriages was lifted. And then finally, in 1870, the Swedish government granted Jewish citizens full constitutional rights, meaning that they could start to vote. By that time, you actually had some kind of a parliamentary system and some kind of a vote for a limited number of citizens, male property owners, things like that. But those rights were also extended to Jewish, Swedish citizens. And 1870 can sound kind of late, but I mean, if you compare to the U.S., that's pretty much in line with when the 14th Amendment in the U.S. was passed, and the 14th Amendment granted equal rights, voting rights to all citizens of the U.S. So that's like a post-Reconstruction, post-U.S., post-Civil War amendment. But still, we're talking about in Sweden a very small Jewish population. Up until the 1880s, the population was only about 3,000 people in total, living in all these different places around the country. And most of them had backgrounds from Germany, or Germanic backgrounds, which today could be from a much larger area than just the formal Germany. Most of them were a part of the German Reform movement. But this began to change when things started to go south in Russia, when anti-Semitism, I mean, there was always anti-Semitism in Russia, and even worse restrictions there than I just told you about in Sweden. But when anti-Semitism and the worst of the pogroms in the late 1800s started to really drive many, many Jews out of Russia, you saw millions leaving for places like the US and Canada and Palestine. And to get to, as they were leaving Russia, many of these people transited through the Nordics, through Finland and Sweden and Denmark. And many decided to stay in places like Sweden. So the population over a very short period of time, relatively short period of time, actually doubled from 3,000 to 6,500. And that was significant. It was significant in a couple of different ways, because you had this very monolithic Jewish population in Sweden. Suddenly, there was Reform, they were Germanic. Now there's Orthodox, Russian, Yiddish speaking. It's a much different type of community after the 1880s. And one of those people from Russia, if you look to this picture to the right, is a guy named Enoch Finkelstein. And Enoch, maybe he's a relative of ours. Enoch, he opened a clothing and supply shop and this picture is from a mining town in northern Sweden called Malmberget. And Malmberget is about 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So we talk about far off places like North Dakota and other places where Jews have settled. This is 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So you can see that the Jewish population is beginning to spread to many different parts of Sweden by this point. This period between the 1800s and the 1900s is really interesting for Sweden, because Sweden for a long time it was a big empire around the Baltic Sea, but then they started to really have a lot of trouble, and they lost most of their empire to Russia and to Germany and to Denmark as well. And after hundreds of years of war and spending a ton of money out of the royal treasury, Sweden decided, we've had enough of trying to build an empire. And this is when they declared that their non-alliance policy. You've probably heard that Sweden was a neutral country in World War I, World War II. Well, that actually goes back even further, back to the late 1800s. And it was around this time that Sweden declared that it would be neutral in any future conflicts. Sweden was also at this time going through a really difficult economic and identity crisis, basically. They had lost Finland to Russia, which was about half of their territory. They had really terrible economy, and this meant that public opinion really hardened when it comes to immigration. And so very few Jews after this period of 1880, after this declaration of neutrality, as it started to become more insular, there was a really hardening of their immigration policy. Very few Jews could come to Sweden, were allowed to reside in Sweden. after this time and up until about the middle of the Second World War. And one of the most, I guess, saddest examples of this kind of anti-immigration or, xenophobia, basically, was that at the eve of World War II, this isn't Swedish authorities basically went to the German authorities, who were the Nazis at the time, and said, well, we want to know what Jews are leaving Germany for Sweden. So we would like you to identify them in their passports. And basically the Swedish authorities asked for the German authorities to stamp a J in any German Jewish passport so that the Swedish border patrol could easily identify them and deny them entry into the country. So it's a very sad example of how these types of anti-immigration, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiments existed at the time. And this is, this map to the right, this is a map of Europe. You're probably all very familiar with the Axis and the Allies and how Europe was divided at the time. The Allies are in red. The blue part of the map is the Axis powers plus the occupied portions of Europe, those which Nazi Germany had occupied or it basically had puppet governments. But during this, Sweden was officially neutral. It had a neutrality policy, but that comes with a number of caveats. So basically, Sweden, when it comes to Finland, for example, Finland was fighting this war for its own independence against Russia at the same time that the Second World War was breaking out. And Sweden actively supported Finland during their War of Independence. It's actually called the Winter War, during, I think, 1940, 1941. And if not militarily, they did support them with a lot of economic assistance. A lot of volunteers from Sweden went over to Finland to fight the Russians or the Soviets at the time. And so Sweden was definitely not neutral when it came to Finland and Russia. But it was also not neutral when it came to economic ties with Germany, because Sweden for centuries had very close cultural and economic connections between Germany. It was their biggest trading partner. And as the war broke out, all of the allies, England, the US, most of the war that it was not on the Axis team, cut off business ties with Germany, and that left a huge gap that Sweden was more than willing to fill. So Sweden actually increased its business connections, its trade with Germany during this time, and probably I don't mean to harp on Sweden and point too many fingers, but the probably the saddest and most notorious example of this was during the war. Sweden allowed train transport from Norway across Sweden into the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets, and that included goods that were transported, but also included troops. So in that way, Sweden was complicit during the Second World War in part. But that began to change when Germany started to lose, basically, come around 1942, when the tides of war were changing. Sweden's policy towards Germany also changed. And by the end of the war, by the last years of the war, Sweden cut off its business ties with Germany entirely and began to actively support the Allied war efforts. And this allowed, because Sweden was still officially neutral, this allowed Sweden to take the lead on a number of rescue operations, which didn't necessarily make up for its complacency during the war, but it did have a significant impact. You may have heard of a couple of these, but I'm just going to go through a few of the more well-known examples. As people in Sweden started to understand the atrocities that the Nazi regime was committing, they became more open to accepting refugees, and that started with first accepting close to 1,000 Norwegian Jews as refugees into Sweden in 1942. And then in 1943, in a really dramatic overnight operation, basically the entire Jewish population of Denmark was brought over on fishing boats overnight, in one night, in October of 1943, were brought over from Denmark over to southern Sweden with the help of fishermen, with the help of the Swedish government. Anybody who had boats in that part of the country helped bring everybody over. And then probably the famous rescue operation was that led by the diplomat Raoul Wallenberg. He was a diplomat in Budapest, and basically he saved thousands of Hungarian Jews by creating, they're called protective passports, or Schutzpass. These protective passports basically gave temporary Swedish citizenship to anyone who held them, and he gave them out to thousands of Hungarian Jews, and was able to bring them to safety in a number of different safe houses throughout Budapest. And sadly, in the last days of the war, he was captured by the Soviets, thrown in jail, and died in jail. The Russians have never explained how and when he died, but they sent a cryptic letter in the 1950s saying that, yeah, he died at some point in our jail. He was a spy. So it's a sad chapter that we never know what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. But he was honored in Israel as one of the righteous among nations. He got honorary citizenship in the US, in Canada, in Australia. So I'm proud to say that his boyhood home is about a couple of miles from where I live in Stockholm. Finally, I just want to mention one more of these rescue operations, is that in the last months of the war, the Swedish Red Cross, led by, I think he was the then king's cousin or brother. His name was Count Folke Bernadotte. And this count, he drove down a caravan of buses to Germany and what is now the Czech Republic, and rescued thousands of prisoners out of concentration camps, among them Theresienstadt. And many of them were, not all of them, but probably the majority were Jewish prisoners. And they were brought back to Sweden on these white buses. I think it was 15,000 prisoners in all. So it was a very significant number compared to other rescue operations. And ironically, or in a strange twist of fate, this Count Folke Bernadotte, he got involved in trying to negotiate some kind of a peace plan between the Arab population of Palestine, the Jewish population of Palestine, and the UK government. And he was assassinated in Jerusalem by a Jewish paramilitary group called the Stern Gang. And the Stern Gang, they were notorious. But what is interesting is that Yitzhak Shamir, who would become the prime minister, he was a member of this Stern Gang. He wasn't the guy who assassinated Folke Bernadotte, but he was definitely one of the members of this gang. So immigration after the Second World War continued. Sweden opened up certainly for accepting more and more refugees. And what we saw is there was immigration. A large number of Jewish immigrants came from Poland in the 1960s, because despite the fact that it was after the atrocities of the Holocaust, Poland still had a number of pogroms that the state sponsored, because it basically wanted to blame Jews for its continued economic problems. And so a number of Jews left, especially in 1968, and many came to Sweden, academics, professionals. Many came to Sweden and represent a significant part of the population here today. But if we go to this is one of the last, if we bring the Jewish community in Sweden up to modern times, this is the map of Sweden today. What we have is that the Jewish community is the largest number, it's pretty diverse. That's what I wanted to say, is that in addition to immigrants from Scandinavia or people with backgrounds from Scandinavia, you also have a large number of Russian Jews living in Sweden, Jews from Poland, from other Eastern European countries, even from Israel. There's not an insignificant number of Israelis in the Swedish community, Swedish Jewish community, as well as from North America. I'm an example of that. The Swedish community is the largest Jewish community in Sweden is in Stockholm with about 5,000 members. They estimate that maybe another 3,000 to 5,000 people with Jewish background live in Stockholm but are unaffiliated. There in the city we have 3 different synagogues. There's 2 Orthodox synagogues, 1 conservative, which is the main congregation. There's a brand new, relatively past 5 years, Jewish Community Center, a Jewish school, a nursing home. There's an Institute for Jewish Studies, and then which I'm a member of. There's also a relatively large and growing Reform congregation. We don't have our own synagogue, but it's definitely a very fast-growing community. There's also synagogues and Jewish communities in other cities like Gothenburg and Malmö, which are the other 2 large cities in the country, as well as a couple other smaller cities. And you know, the Jewish community is very, very well integrated into Swedish society, and have been for a long time, and such that in about 1999, the Swedish government recognized Yiddish as an official minority language. So Swedish is the official language. Then there's like four minority languages that are also kind of official minority languages, and Yiddish is one of them, which I think that after starting with one German engraver named Aaron, I think that's a pretty fitting recognition for a community that's basically, you know, only 250 years old. So that concludes my part of the history part of my talk. I just want to briefly touch on a couple of big topics that you might have heard about in the news, or that you just I think are some of the major topics that are impacting both Sweden and the Jewish community. These are very complex issues. I am no expert by any stretch of the mind on any of these, but I wanted to try to give just a little bit of context, because you do hear about NATO and Europe and NATO and Sweden, or you do maybe read about, you know, some Quran burnings that are taking place in Sweden, and some of the elections that have taken place lately. But if I start with the NATO issue, I talked about before that Sweden was neutral for like 150 years. It was non-aligned. It wasn't part of NATO. It wasn't part of any kind of military pact or alliance. But that changed with the illegal Russian invasion and war on Ukraine. And so Sweden very quickly applied, along with Finland, gave its application for NATO. Finland was accepted and is a full member today. That application was approved and ratified a few months ago. I want to say like 4 or 5 months ago. Sweden's application has stalled. There's broad support for Sweden to enter into NATO in Sweden by the population, but there are forces both in the country and outside the country which oppose us. One of those tricky parts is Turkey. Turkey is the last country to not ratify or not give a clear yes for Swedish membership. They have said that, yeah, we will approve this, but it's not a done deal yet. And that basically stems from the fact that Sweden has accepted a significant number of what's called Kurdish refugees. This is a small minority from Turkey who are fighting for their own independence, or fighting a kind of a low-level conflict with Turkey in the eastern part of the country. Turkey's not happy about Sweden having these Kurdish refugees in the country. They would like some of them extradited for crimes, to be charged and convicted in Turkey. Sweden does not want to do that because they are very strong on human rights and non-extradition for death penalties in countries that have the death penalty. So that has been a key sticking point for the delay on Sweden's entry into NATO. There's also some people within Sweden who don't want Sweden to enter into NATO. Some of these are also using other issues to try to muddy the waters on the application into NATO. And one of those issues is religion. You may have heard about some. I don't know if you've heard about it, but in the news, it's a big deal here. People will go out and they will protest by burning a Quran. They've also burned Torahs and copies of the Bible, but they'll burn copies of the Quran in front of embassies like the Iraqi embassy or the Turkish embassy. Some of these are people who want to test the limits of free speech. Some of them just want to anger places like Turkey, and that what we've seen is a very strong diplomatic response. But you've also seen protests break out both in Sweden but also in the Middle East. So it's meant that the security situation for Sweden has gotten worse. It's definitely dangerous for embassy personnel, Swedish embassy personnel in the Middle East right now. There's a lot of threats towards embassies, Swedish embassies in places like Iraq and throughout the Middle East. So this is one of those things that it's kind of simmering, and it's caused a lot of issues both for the NATO application but also for just security in general. All of these issues are kind of tied, but a year ago, Sweden also elected a new government, and one party in this multi-party coalition government that they have they're a populist party called the Swedish Democrats. They are anti-immigrant, they are anti-EU. They were historically against NATO application, and they have a very, very divisive rhetoric when it comes to minority groups, including Jews. And they have also been supportive of these Quran burnings, which exacerbate all of these other issues. So it's kind of, they also have, sadly, they also have a background. The party started as a neo-Nazi party. So it's terrible that they are able to participate in government, but they were elected. They got a pretty sizable percentage of the vote. And so that's just something that we in Sweden are dealing with today. And then the last one of these kind of connected issues is economics. The world has been facing inflation all over, but just to give you just a couple of numbers, inflation in Sweden was 12% in December of last year. So a gallon of gas here costs today about $8. I don't know what it costs in Arizona, but $8 it's pretty rough to go to the pump these days. And all of these issues, while they're not specifically impacting the Jewish community, they definitely are felt within the community. Especially the protests, especially when people go out and burn a Torah in front of the synagogue, trying to exercise their free speech rights, or when there's protests around Quran burnings, because those sadly often take on an anti-Semitic nature as well. So these are just a few of the things that are simmering and brewing on a sad side in Sweden right now. But I don't want to only talk about doom and gloom. Sweden is an open, wonderful place for minority groups, for the Jewish community. It's really thrived within Sweden. So if you ever get a chance to visit, it's a great place to visit. It's a great place to be. It's an open, welcoming society. So I'd encourage you to do so. So now I guess what I'd like to do is just open it up. That's the end of my talk. I just want to open it up for anyone who has any questions for me. And Michael, I guess I'll let you. I don't know how you want to do the questions. If people want to come up to the microphone, if
Generally,
you
the
want to
best way is if somebody just, we have a small
yeah,
enough group, if somebody just raises their hand and has a
yeah.
question.
And if you could
Um,
just call on them, I think that would be the easiest, probably.
sure, sure. Okay, I'll get the ball rolling. I can't, if there's anybody there, Les, who's raising their hand, that's sort of a small screen, so you'll let me know. I think it looks like there's somebody back
Marcia
there.
has a question.
Okay,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Marcia.
Thank you so much. You really gave a great
Why don't you come
speech
up here?
because I have to go talk to you. Yeah.
Well,
I'll
thank
have
you
her
very
come up
much.
closer to the mic.
Well, that's fine. We'll hear you better. But I was happy to be able to come back again and be able to talk to you all.
The mic is
I'm not
right
an
there.
expert on any of this, but I do like to be the know-it-all sometimes.
Here?
Yeah.
I just talk here.
Yeah.
Hi, I want to
Hi.
thank you for this wonderful overview of your country, and the relationship with them is very wonderful because it's like one world up there.
Mhm.
I was so fortunate many years ago to go on Finnair, a travel to see all the countries in the area.
Mhm.
And your country is beautiful. And the art is beautiful because I'm an artist. And all the museums and all the beautiful places to eat and go underground and do things was we felt like explorers in another world. Now, maybe you can help me with a query I had. We went to one country, and I don't know if it was Finland or one of the other countries that had a city that had a most interesting synagogue. Inside was over us were all of beautiful stars. And they had a community there that was very supportive of Israel because a lot of people from there went to Israel. Israelis came to teach. They had three wonderful buildings. They had the synagogue, they had a school for children, and they had a home for the elderly, all in one complex. Do you know what country it was?
Well, it's not Stockholm because the nursing home, the Jewish nursing home is a separate building. It's in Stockholm. And then the design of the synagogue that you're talking about, I don't recognize, but it could be in the southern city of Malmö. So just across the water from Copenhagen. No, that would be Sweden.
Oh.
I'm not familiar with the synagogues in Helsinki or in Oslo. I've been in the one in Copenhagen, and it doesn't fit that description. But my guess, and I can do a quick search to see what the inside of the synagogue looks like in Malmö. My guess it would be that synagogue, because there's also a nursing home there and a school, all in the same complex of the synagogue.
Well, thank you so much. There has been a lot of contact with your group of countries with Israel. And these people came from Israel and came for 2 years to teach. And then people went from your country, one of the countries, to work in Israel. It was a beautiful exchange, an international experience. But I thank you because you opened a lot of doors for us to see. I don't travel too much, but I remember those countries and walking in them. And one of the country we were in, you couldn't even say a word because there were so many letters to every word.
Sounds like Finnish,
Iceland?
maybe.
No, it wasn't Iceland. I've never been in Iceland.
Okay.
So thank you so much for coming into our home today.
Thank you for having me.
David, is there any kind of interfaith efforts that go on? Is it still primarily Lutheran population, or is
Yeah,
there?
I mean, I think one thing I should have added is that Sweden is a very secularized country. So most people belong to the Lutheran Church. but I would say that they're active in a with their church. It's a very small number of people, and so that kind of to be religious puts you already in the kind of unique part of the population. But in terms of interfaith, so there's very strong interfaith cooperation, because I think everyone feels like, well, those of us who are or active with our communities, we have something in common because so much of the population is secularized. So there are definitely outreach efforts and interfaith groups meeting between the Muslim community in Sweden and the Jewish community, between the Jewish community and the both, not as much the Catholic, but with the Lutheran Church. There's definitely very strong ties between the Lutheran Church and the Jewish community, for sure. In fact, one of the cantor, the former cantor of the Stockholm community, he would frequently go to be invited to some of the church, the main bishop's services, that the bishop that holds the church services for the royal family would be invited for those services. So there are definitely a lot of contacts and a lot of interfaith activities that go on, because I think they feel like they're in it together.
So they may do some mock seders.
I mean, the Jewish, you can definitely. I haven't been at a Seder where members from outside the Jewish community were there, and that's a good point. I wonder if they open it up in that kind of a way, but I haven't heard of that before.
Anybody else?
I think, yeah.
Oh, Sunad.
I just wanted to say I have a friend from Zimbabwe, and she met a Swedish man on an ulpan in Israel, and she's been living in Stockholm for a long time now. Jessica Adler.
Okay.
Probably don't know her, she's older than you. And also my grandfather, Steve wanted me to say this, my grandfather he and his family went from Russia to Sweden, and their name was Kasparovsky, but in Sweden they used the patronymics, and their father was Abraham. So half of the family changed their name to Abramson, and then they went to Southern Rhodesia, and the other half went to the US.
Okay. Do you know where in Sweden they were living?
I'm not sure. I have a book by my cousin. I would have to look it up.
That's interesting. I feel like I focused a lot on well, obviously, because that's what the talk was about Jewish history. I didn't really talk so much about Swedish culture, because Sweden does have a fascinating culture, fascinating and very interesting culture around nature and their relationship to nature. It's a thriving art scene, thriving obviously film and literature, and it's really it's a wonderful place, a really good balance in terms of balance between the professional life and between your family life, and really good strong social net that kind of takes care of as many people as possible. So it's, from that way, it's a very egalitarian society in many ways. There's issues, and there's reforms that need to be done, but it's a pretty fair society.
I believe a few years. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amy.
My maiden name is Lund. I noticed that there was a Lund, Sweden. Does the term Lund translate?
Lund is, there's
Does
a
it
big
have a
university.
meaning?
Yeah, that's a good question. Lund is the name of a city. It's a student university city in the southern part of Sweden, not so far from Denmark. But a Lund, I don't actually know what the word means. I want to say it has something to do with trees. My wife would probably know better than I do. I could look it up for you before we finish and see what it means.
Thank you.
But it's most well known, the word Lund, for the city of Lund in the south, where there's this. It's one of Sweden. one of Europe's oldest universities. Beautiful city down in the south part of the country.
I think a few years ago, if my memory serves me right, there was a TV show put on by the comedian Amy Poehler, and I believe it was about her brother living in Sweden, marrying a Swedish girl, and it was an interesting side, that most of us had never seen before. I'm not sure how accurate it was and how it was received over in Sweden.
Greg Poehler, he lives in Sweden, and his wife is Swedish. He's just like me, except the fact that his sister is a famous TV star. And he starred in this show. It's called Welcome to Sweden, I think.
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny, very
Oh, yeah.
drew on all the stereotypes, but it talked about his experience of being a newcomer in Sweden and all the funny Swedish customs and things that you have to when you're a fish out of water. So it's a good introduction into Sweden.
Yes.
Just got an email. Excuse me, I'll let Sunat go. Just got an email from a rabbi. He got his times messed up, and so he just sent me one. He says, "My bad." I said, "Well, why don't you come on now? At least he can introduce himself." So let's see if he links
Oh,
it.
that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, go ahead, Sunat.
And I just want to say I looked it up, and my grandfather and his brother did land in Lund, and then they worked for their brother in Malmö.
Malmö, that's the city right next to Lund.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A big shipping port city, right across from Denmark.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Are there many people of color in Sweden, either from Northern Africa or transplants from the U.S.?
I think much like we talked about earlier with the Jewish population, I mean, the population in Sweden was very monolithic. It was all uniform. It was Scandinavian up until kind of maybe the 1940s. And then as Sweden first started to accept more immigrants just because it needed workers, it needed laborers basically to build work on construction projects in the cities, to work on agriculture. They started accepting more immigrants from Southern Europe, so like Italians and Turks and Greeks. And then that turned into, during the 90s, a lot of Yugoslavian from former Yugoslavia, from the conflict there, came to Sweden. So you have a lot of Serbians and Croatians that moved. And then I think not the early, during the 70s, during the Iran conflict, and after the Iranian Revolution, we have a very large Persian population here. And in more recent years, like in the 2000s, usually refugees, or at least forced immigration or immigration under duress, large Somali population, large Ethiopian population, if we're talking about North Africa. I think in total, the people with non-Scandinavian backgrounds, if you want to say immigrant backgrounds, you have about 10% of the population has background outside of Sweden or Scandinavia. But it's grown over the last couple of decades, for sure. That's relatively new. So Sweden hasn't been so used to immigration large scale immigration up until the past 20, 30 years.
Does Stockholm either have a kosher deli or a way for people to keep some form of kosher?
Yeah, I had a friend coming over from Israel back in June, and the Orthodox rabbi there has a list of all the kosher foods and what's accepted. So there is a kosher shop that you can go to, and then there's approved list of kosher products. But you can buy meat at a kosher shop that's located inside the Jewish Community Center. And then they keep a large list of restaurants and then of products that are approved kosher. So it's a little tricky, but there are some restaurants and cafes which are under rabbinical approval.
It's tricky in Tucson.
Yeah, I was going to say that's
Mhm.
nothing. We lived in South Carolina. That was a challenge.
How big is the
So,
Jewish community in Tucson? I mean, I gotta imagine, I hear a couple of different accents here from out east
yeah.
and in the Midwest,
Oh,
so I'm sure there's,
how big would it be in Tucson? Does anybody have any idea? No, there's about
25,000 maybe.
okay.
I'm not sure.
probably a dozen different synagogues or temples.
Well,
Of course, there's, yeah, Roberta?
Tucson actually is a very Jewish city
Mm-hmm.
because of the founders of Tucson and
Uh-huh.
the university and other places like that. But finding kosher food or
Yeah.
a kosher restaurant or a deli or a good bagel is extremely difficult.
It's a culinary desert.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, that's how I feel sometimes in Sweden when it comes to bagels and deli food. That's the thing I miss the most, getting a good bagel. My idea is to start up my own bagel shop, import the bagel making machine, and just
Oh,
be able to have my own bagels here. So,
probably
I
do
know
well.
somebody who started a bagel shop in Alaska. I can't remember the
Really?
town offhand. He was
Yeah.
an immediate success.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to do that.
Yep. Find that culinary desert. What's the sentiment of the folks there about support of Ukraine?
Very supportive here. If you remember when I was talking about Sweden, probably their biggest rival in the Baltic was Russia. Sweden fought hundreds of years worth of wars with Russia, going back to the 1700s, and even before, with the Vikings were the first people in Russia. Some would say that the word Russia is actually a word for Vikings from a part of Sweden.
Huh.
Rus comes
Rus.
from Roslag, which is just north of Stockholm. It's not been, I think an academic or real historian would argue something differently. But in any case, Russia is a huge rival, was a huge historical rival to Sweden. And so there's always this kind of baked into Swedish DNA is this fear of Russia. So there's been a very strong support for Ukraine after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for historical reasons, but for also reasons that it's just a terrible thing that's happening to Ukraine.
Yeah. Okay. David, our rabbi, apologizes. He's been having some internet issues. In fact, Les is supposedly going there this weekend to help him out.
Saturday.
He says, okay, just send a message. My regards and apologies to all.
No worries. May the
He's a
Lord
fascinating
grant him.
person. He's well traveled, and he's knows rabbis all over the world. I mean, he ran into somebody and he says, "Oh, I bar mitzvah the son or whatever," or Anyways,
Well,
but
maybe for our next talk,
yes.
you can introduce him.
That'd be lovely. That'd be wonderful. But anyway, it's getting late over there, David. It's already late, but we certainly all appreciate your taking the time to educate us, enrich us with the information.
Thank
And
you.
yes,
Thank you for having me.
Thank
you're
you.
welcome. I, for
hope I
one,
can come and
I'm sorry.
I hope I can come and pay you a visit in the warm parts of Arizona someday soon.
You're always welcome here. It's a unique part of the world. Not being from this area, in fact, most of us are not from this area, but we've come to love it because it's a very family-oriented environment, because everybody comes from someplace else. And our temple is a microcosm of that, because we call ourselves reconformidox, meaning that we try to appeal to all branches, anybody interested in the Jewish way of life. And that provides somewhat of a challenge for us, but we try to keep our doors open figuratively and literally. And, we're really proud of what we've been doing at this, what one of our earlier members called this Jewish oasis in the desert. So Yeah, you're always welcome. And once
Maybe I'll have to
again, like,
listen into a service one time.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, but have Ruth Ann or whoever publishes the YouTube link to let you know. What time would that be? That would be 7. Well, the Friday night service would be 7 o'clock, so it'd be quite early for you in the morning. But
Yeah, not possible.
yeah, I know Gary Melton has done that for Malaysia. In fact, it was funny, but when we were supposed to have the program on May 31st, unfortunately, when he got ill, Gary was one of the people who was on, and
Mm.
it was like 3 in the morning for him, but he was looking forward to it. So I don't know what happened today because I think he planned to be on. Hopefully, he didn't get mixed up too at the time. That's life.
Well, thank you again for having me. I
Okay,
think
wonderful.
I
We appreciate it. And we'll continue our conversation. I
Thank you,
might,
David. It was very interesting.
I'm good.
yes.
I'm glad to hear that.